Hello and welcome. You're about to watch the second of our anxiety videos, Understanding How to Break the Anxiety Cycle. This is part of the Wellbeing Education Resilience Programme. We would like to highlight the Face COVID video by Russ Harris. If you haven't already seen it, please take 5 minutes to watch, as it gives a great overview of how to support wellbeing as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. You can click directly on the link when viewing this presentation in slideshow mode. This video will be looking at understanding how to break the anxiety cycle. Some of the topics touched upon in this video may be discussed in further detail in the concept index video. This will be shown to you using this star. They may also be covered in one of the other webinar videos in the programme. It may be helpful to take a moment to familiarise yourself with some of the other video webinar titles that we cover. Should you have any questions in regards to these videos, please forward these to your mental health lead and they can be discussed in one of our network meeting Q&As. Here you can see what will be covered in this presentation. If you see the thought bubble symbol, it will mean there is an activity for you to have a go at should you wish to. Simply pause the video and give it a go. Remember to always be kind to yourself when watching these video presentations. Be aware of how you're feeling throughout, and should you need to, take a break or check in with a friend. There are also some suggestions on the last slides for places you can go if you would like to seek further support. For this presentation, it will be helpful for you to have some understanding of the concepts highlighted in this slide. If you're not familiar with any of them, you can find them in the concept index.
And again, we have the CBT cycle, as explained in session 1. Just to recap, the idea that the CBT approach to anxiety gets us to think about how there's an external or internal trigger that creates anxiety, and as a result we have a physical response, a cognitive response, an emotional response, and a behavioural response, and how they all interact and influence each other and create further anxiety. And again, as was in the previous session, we spoke about how to break the cycle, and the idea that we need to start to recognise what our triggers are and notice the physical symptoms, and then to avoid that escalating, we can also find ways in which to break the cycle through thinking differently and challenging our thoughts about the situation, and acting differently by doing things differently to make a change and a break in the cycle.
In preparation for this presentation, we would like you to take some time to think about the different things that worry you. We then want you to think about the sorts of things that might worry our children and young people. Are there any of these things the same? Or are there differences? It is very important that we take the time to reflect on these things, as once we acknowledge our worries and fears, then we can start to work towards managing them. It may also be helpful to keep these in mind when watching the next slides and anxiety video 3, in order to assess what may work best for you or your young people when starting your journey to reducing anxiety. So when you're ready, stop the video and give yourself time to reflect on these questions. So now I've had a little bit of time to think about the worries that children and young people have compared to the worries that adults might have. We're just going to take a look at some different examples of our children's stresses. You may have thought of some different ones as well. From the ones that are listed on this slide, you can see that a lot of their stresses are very similar to those of adults, maybe in slightly different contexts, but if we were to fit them into different categories, they can be very similar. So for example, academic work and schoolwork may be exams and tests, whereas adults may be thinking more about work deadlines and workload. And things like money and finances and social pressures, they'd be in a different context to that of an adult, but they are still there for children and young people as well. This is really important because when we think about what our young people worry about, it might be a bit easier for us to empathise with them if we're thinking about, have we ever been in that situation ourselves, or can we relate to that? It is also important to take the time to consider what kinds of parental worries have been created or intensified as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. As we all know, the pandemic has been such a struggle for lots of parents, and entering the new normal comes with its own concerns, as highlighted in this slide. In order to support your young people with their anxieties, it is key to look into any worries their parents may have. Are these influencing their child's anxieties? Does their parent also need support for their own mental health? It is so important that all parts of the young person's support network are working together, and parents may need a lot of support from us in order to do this.
So we're now going to have a look at how we can manage our thoughts, and we can do that by following these 5 different points. And we're going to have a look in a bit more detail at these later on. So firstly, we can do that by thinking realistically, by realising that our thoughts are only thoughts. So just because we think something doesn't mean that it's fact or that it's going to happen. By keeping our expectations of ourselves realistic, building our self-esteem, confidence and positivity, and actually recognising our unhelpful thoughts so that then we can actively replace them with more helpful thoughts. Now, these things obviously sound easier said than done, but the more we actively engage in helping to manage our thoughts through these different ways of thinking, over time, the easier that will become, and the more we'll be able to manage our thoughts in relation to anxiety. So thinking of the first step in those 5 steps that we can do to manage our thought is the process of thinking realistically. So there's a 4-step process that you can follow to help yourself try to think more realistically. So when we are having maybe unrealistic or unhelpful and negative or anxious thoughts, we need to firstly have the mindfulness and the ability to actually be aware that those thoughts are there and they're not very helpful for us in that moment. So actually being mindful and recognising that, and then moving on to trying to stop that thought. So we can do that literally by telling ourselves, right, stop, this isn't helpful, and by saying, no, I'm not going to think about this, whatever it is that helps you to try and stop that thought in its track, and then moving on to assessing it. So why am I feeling like that? Is it possibly a normal reaction because I feel unsafe, for example? What can I do to kind of make this thought better? And then moving on to challenging that thought. So again, developing onto what you can do. So is it that you might need to problem solve, maybe with someone else? It's how we can fix the situation. Is it that you just need to replace that thought with a more realistic one? Is it that you might need to engage in some different maybe breathing exercises or something that you can do to alleviate the anxiety, which we'll look at in a bit more detail later on. But just following these 4 steps, and again, this isn't going to work once and that's it. You might have to keep going through this process various times in the day and throughout your life, to be honest. But the more that we engage in this, the more it will be easier for us to think realistically in the long run, so that it doesn't kind of our thoughts don't feed the anxiety even more. Another way to break the anxiety cycle is by managing our behaviours. And there's 3 main ways of doing this. So first, by reducing your reliance on safety behaviours. So this is mentioned in part 1 of these anxiety sessions. Reducing compulsive behaviours. So these are all about those repetitive behaviours that may be as a result of your anxiety. So trying to reduce those. And implementing positive and constructive coping strategies. And here are some examples of how you can implement positive and constructive coping strategies.
You can pause this slide now if you'd like to have a quick look through these. However, these are all explained in more detail in part 3 of these sessions.
This is an image of the anxiety curve. We can use this to explain the concept of gradual exposure. When we feel very anxious, we tend to have a point where we will rely on a safety behaviour or an anxious behaviour to help us escape the anxious situation. We call this the opt-out point. We tend to believe that if we had not opted out, that our anxiety would have kept increasing and increasing and increasing and never gone away, or in extreme cases we may feel like we would have died had we not opted out. This is demonstrated by the straight diagonal line on the graph. However, had we stayed with the anxious situation, yes, our anxiety would have grown, but it would have eventually decreased, as our anxious feelings do not last forever. This is the idea behind gradual exposure. By exposing ourselves to our anxious trigger, we will prove to ourselves that we will not be harmed or die, and as a result, our anxiety will start to lessen. The more we expose ourselves to the trigger, the quicker our anxiety will decrease over time. This is something that needs to be planned with the person experiencing the anxiety and done in gradual steps. You may even have to support them through it. You do not want them to become distressed, which is why we do it in small, manageable steps. This process helps them develop resiliency and manage their anxiety for a lasting period, rather than feeling better in the short term, as is the case with our opt-out safety behaviours. This grid shows us what kinds of strategies work best for different anxious symptoms. For example, challenging our negative thoughts and replacing them with positive ones can reduce both our anxious thoughts and our unpleasant physical sensations. Grounding techniques, breathing, soothing such as a sensory comfort like a soft teddy, and even energizers like exercise can reduce the physical sensations we feel with anxiety, and they make us feel more helpful emotions. Emotion coaching teaches us about how we feel, and empathizing instantly calms our emotions. The problem solving and reflection aspects helps us to reduce our anxious behaviours and replace them with positive coping strategies. By being there for our young people and prompting them to use coping strategies and to encourage them to face and stick with their uncomfortable feelings in order to overcome their anxiety, and taking this journey along with them, can prove to them that their anxiety trigger is nothing to be anxious about, therefore reducing their anxious thoughts and reducing their reliance on safety behaviours.
Now we just wanted to briefly talk about the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is a nerve that runs from the top of your head in your brainstem to all of your body down to your colon. So you can see that in the image on the left. And it's responsible for controlling our heart rate, our lungs, kidney functions, liver functions, and basically everything that keeps us healthy. And it's also been found to be a key contributor to mood. So it helps deal with our anxiety and depression. So by stimulating this nerve, it can help send a message to your body to relax and de-stress, and this can help improve our mood, well-being, and resilience. There's a link at the bottom of this slide where you can have a look at some further information around the vagus nerve if you're interested. And in part 3 of these anxiety sessions, we'll go into a bit more detail about how you can actually stimulate the vagus nerve.
So now we're going to look at the neuroscience behind calming the stress response, looking at why all of the strategies that we've spoken about previously work in relation to our brain. So if we are able to change our thoughts and behaviours around anxiety-provoking triggers, then we can change our perception of them. So no longer perceiving them as a threat, and as a result our brainstem will not be put into action, meaning that our fight, flight and freeze response will not be triggered. This in turn will reduce our physical sensations and our desire to escape, hide from or fight the anxiety trigger. It will also mean that we are able to think more rationally, making it easier to challenge our anxious thoughts further, as our cognitive brain will be able to be more engaged too. As we know that when our brainstem is less active, our cortical brain is more able to fully engage. In turn, this will all bring on more of a sense of happiness, calm, and content from our limbic brain. So to finish off, we're going to be doing a brief overview of the different things that schools can be doing to help their children in school. It is really important to be linking in with parents and carers and aiming to work together on strategies. It is no point in putting lots of work in at school and there's nothing being done at home. It is only going to be successful where everybody is working together. Use the 5 R's, AID memoir and PFA frameworks to remember steps to take. So this wasn't discussed in any of our anxiety videos, but there are different video presentations purely on the 5 R's and the PFA frameworks. So it'd be really good to take a look at those where you can. Listen carefully and praise them for sharing. Let them know that everyone gets anxious sometimes, especially in stressful situations. Normalising anxiety is really important in the tackle to decreasing it. Simple things to do. Suggest they try to focus on what is going on around them and to let go of the panicky thoughts. So this is our mindfulness and our grounding techniques that we've spoken about. Address or test negative expectations. This is looking at our thought stopping and challenging our thoughts. Address uncertainty where you can. This is very much for what if thinkers. Problem solving is really important and it will be discussed in the next presentation, Anxiety 3. Promote a sense of control. Make sure that the young person knows that they are in control of their anxiety. Their anxiety does not control them. Support manageable steps to overcome fears. So this is looking at the anxiety curve and sticking with them through the process of gradual exposure. Support young people to get active, have a go and put their fears to the test rather than overthinking. Check in again on their anxiety levels. It is really important to make sure that we are understanding where our children are at on a scale of 0 to 10 because we don't want to push them too far, but also we want to make sure that we are pushing them a little bit to help them overcome their anxieties. We do not want them to stay in their comfort zones. That's really important. They need to push their boundaries in order to reduce their anxieties. But we just, like I say, do not want to make sure we're pushing them too far. You can also use this as a reflection to see if you have made a difference or if they have made a difference. So a scale of 0 to 10 is really important to use throughout the process. So as explained, these are really important things that schools can do to help their children and young people to reduce and manage their anxieties.